Hi class. So for this session we're going to talk about the artist as ethologist. Ethology is the study of animal behavior. So I'm going to provide you with some key concepts, a real brief history of ethology, which today most ethologists would describe themselves as behavioral ecologists, but ethology is still a term that's used. For this session, along with this session, you have a few readings by Vicien Desprez. They're really wonderful. They're a lot of fun. I hope you enjoy them. I've given you 4 from the book, or 5, I think. Just pick the 2. If you're ambitious, if you want to read more, go ahead and read more. But the minimum will be to pick the 2 that are most interesting for you. And then there's also a video by Frans de Waal, who's a really prominent primatologist. It's really fun to watch, so watch that too. I won't have time to really address those things in this lecture, but it's going to be very clear. We have a lot to go through, but it'll be very clear how they meet, how they connect, and you'll be able to weigh them in your minds and in your writing as we go forward. So without further ado, artist as ethologist. I like to start talking about ethology actually with a philosopher, a really prominent French philosopher of the 20th century, Jacques Derrida. And towards the end of his life, towards the end of his career, he wrote a book, a very beautiful book, called The Animal That Therefore I Am. And he really takes seriously the question of animals in relation to thinking and philosophy more broadly. There's this really beautiful quote in this text. That I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's a very beautiful passage, so you can always pause it and just read it yourself a little more slowly. It's very dense. So it's a point in the text where he talks about, like, theoretically, this hypothetical scenario of picking up a cuttlefish or an octopus. What you're seeing in the back there, it's a very beautiful image. That's a cuttlefish. A cuttlefish is a type of octopod, a cephalopod, like octopus. Like an octopus or a squid. And so he describes, like, picking it up, but without hurting it and without killing it, and to see if it will expel its ink, which is what these animals, one of the things they can do, along with, they have these chromophores, these capacities to change color. They're pretty incredible. You can Google it and see videos of this. And he says, this is the part that I find very lovely and very compelling. He says he doesn't want to do it any harm, but he wants to see if its ink says something about itself, that its ability to expel this ink, or to even maybe even squiggle away, is a power of being an I. And so he says this is very clear. He says this is not necessarily the power to say I. Like when you attest to yourself that you're an individual and you describe yourself, you say, I am so-and-so, right? Within human speech, we have the ability to attest to ourselves as individuals, as singular beings, through this word I. So of course, a cuttlefish cannot say I, right? But Derrida is saying that it's possible that maybe it can do, it's able to be or to do I, even before, and this is a fancy way of saying before being able to put it into speech. He says even before any autoreferential utterance in a language. And if you think about it, when you use the word I, it's not you using the word I that leads to your being, to your existence, right? Your existence presupposes your ability to say I. So there's something underneath, something that comes before your I, which is your power to be, right? Power to do I. And what Derrida is saying here, and I hope you follow, is that non-human animals of all kinds don't have the ability to say I, but they definitely seem to have the ability to do or to be I. And describing animals in this way, a philosopher describing animals in this way, is already to think like an ethologist. It's to look at behavior of animals and to try to understand them, and to try to gain access to an animal, right? And so it's a very lovely passage that I like to use to introduce the ethology. So a short history of modern ethology that begins in the 1920s, 1930s, and it sought to study animal behaviors in a scientific way. So like one of the first times where like any other science, like physics, like any other science, like biology, it wanted to study animals in a very rigorous scientific way. And it began this, you're seeing Konrad Lorenz here with the gray-lag goose, who he's very famous for studying. Konrad Lorenz is one of the first founders of ethology, modern ethology. He definitely fixated mostly on instincts, understanding animals as instinctual creatures, and on fixed behavioral patterns. So like animals have a certain, whatever animal they might be, like the gray-lag goose, they have certain fixed behaviors that you can catalog, that you can study, and that you can sort of scientifically analyze, right? So this was the beginnings of studying of animal behavior in a rigorously scientific way in the early 20th century. What's compelling here, we're largely speaking in our history class, is that right at this time in the 1920s and 1930s, if you've studied surrealism, if you've studied early 20th century art, it too is getting off the ground right at the same time. And the surrealists are one of the first avant-garde movements to really delve into the animal world in all sorts of interesting ways, in film, in object making, as well, but definitely in film. And one of the greats here is Jean Painlevé, who was a surrealist filmmaker, and he I'll just play this for you. He's known for doing, these are almost natural history films before before natural history films. He's fascinated with the non-human world, and he's fascinated by using his ability to use the camera in order to really dig deep and to really get inside this other world. And you know, the surrealists were interested in the unconscious and these ideas coming out of Freud. In some ways, the world of the creature, the world of the animal, is also this kind of unconscious realm, something that exists outside of human language and speech. So it's only natural that the surrealists would be interested in it. So let me show you this clip. These are beautiful old.
L'adulte en miniature est enfin formé. Il peut se déplacer verticalement avec la tête en angle droit du corps. C'est le meilleur stade pour une naissance heureuse. En ralentissant le cœur artificiellement, on distingue mieux le mécanisme de contraction de l'oreillette, du ventricule et du bulbe. Les rayons de la nageoire dorsale sont indépendants. Les tout jeunes chevaux savent déjà fort bien s'accrocher l'un à l'autre et jouer à deux ou trois à pousse-moi, tire-toi. Alors que sa poche est maintenant vide, le mâle est agité longtemps encore de contractions provoquées par la sécrétion gazeuse des parois internes de la poche. Son déplacement lent empêche l'hippocampe de disparaître au loin en cas d'alerte, de se dissimuler rapidement sous les algues ou dans le sable. D'ailleurs, la majesté de cet animal ne s'accorderait pas avec une fuite éperdue, coutumière aux autres poissons.
This is a very lovely section of this famous film of his, The Seahorse, And again, it's suggestive here that you can argue that this is ethological in some ways. It's as if this surrealist filmmaker is doing ethology. He's studying the animal behavior. He's trying to understand what they're like. But at the same time, there's a clear artistic ambition here of permeating, of entering into this non-human world that's kind of surreal, that's kind of uncanny, and that's really fascinating, kind of marvelous, right? Which are all these things that the surrealists would have been interested in. And again, it's interesting that this is all happening in the 1930s, right at the time where modern ethology is getting off the ground within scientific disciplines rather than artistic ones. And so by the time you get to 1973, this is a really pivotal moment for ethology. It's a very big deal to win the Nobel Prize. It's a validation of a discipline. And so in 1973, 3 ethologists are awarded the Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine. One was given, it was won by 3 scientists, by 3 ethologists. The first was Conrad Lorenz, who you already met. Here he is, again, grinning with his gray-lag goose that he studied. The other was Nicholas Tinbergen, who's credited as the other, really important, quote-unquote, father of ethology, of modern ethology. He's really well known for studying seagulls, among other creatures. And then Carl von Frisch, too, who now may be the most well-known of the 3, because Carl von Frisch, he's the one who decoded bee language. One of the things he realized is that bees will communicate to each other where the good stuff is out in out in the fields, like where the good nectar is, or where the nectar, where the flowers are abundant, that sort of thing. So a bee will come back to the hive, and the way the bee communicates to the other bees where it is, he does it through or I don't know why I'm saying the bee is a he. The bee performs this little dance, like this little wiggle dance that communicates where the nectar is. So this might be an example of an animal, a really humble one, like a bee, with the ability to somehow attest to itself, to do I, and to communicate to others in ways that are really fascinating. And Carl von Frisch was the first to find this out. And so right around this time, exactly at this time in 1973, you have a West Coast artist, a U.S. artist out of California, Mark Thompson, who is doing all these works with bees. And he says he was directly influenced by Carl von Frisch and his discoveries of how bees communicate to each other through this dance. And unfortunately, he's not that well known of an artist. And I don't have any videos. I can't really show you any of the work because it's just not available, at least yet. But what he would do, he would work with bees in various ways. And this is one example. It's called Immersion, from 1973 to 1976. This is it's from a 60-minute, 16 millimeter film, which is then transferred to video. And what he did, he has a queen bee that he puts on top of his head. And then over the course of an hour, he just stands there. It's just a shot of him. And then slowly bees start coming in and they start building a hive around his head, and around and in conjunction with this queen bee, which is how bees build hives. And so over the course of the film, his head slowly gets immersed by this mass of bees. And so this is really kind of a fascinating durational film, one that's clearly influenced by ethology and in some ways does give you access to ethological knowledge of how bees congregate and how they develop a hive. And it's very intense, so I can't imagine he didn't get stung once or twice doing these works with bees, but he absolutely loved bees and was fascinated by them and arguably worked with them in his work. So that's a quick introduction to modern ethology. But what happens when we go further back, right? A further history backwards to ethology before it's coined as a term, because of course all sorts of people were interested in looking at animals and in theorizing about animals all the way back to the Greeks, but certainly also non-Western cultures like Chinese scholars, Indian philosophy, and all sorts of things, right? So we're not going to go all the way that far back, but it is important to stop at the beginning of the modern period in the West and talk about Descartes, because René Descartes, who you probably know from his theories of the cogito, I think, therefore I am, he had a very influential theory of what animals were before ethology became a scientific discipline in the 20th century. He argued that animals were quite simply just machines or automatons, that they were basically like organic machines, and that if they looked like they were feeling something, if they looked like they were in pain, it's well known that Descartes practiced vivisection, which is the open operating and cutting open a live animal. In this case, a lot of times it was dogs. He says if the dog is screaming, it's just like a machine. It's not really that important. It's not really feeling anything. It's just like opening up a machine, and the machine is making noise, right? So this is now called the theory, the Cartesian theory of the animal machine, and it had a really long influence. This is in the 16th century, and for a long time, and even still today. I mean, I think there are some people who just assume animals are just these dumb machines that have no real moral worth, and you can do what you want with them. I mean, it had a long-lasting impact. This theory of animals is reducible to simply materials, machines without souls. Right? For Descartes, the important thing is that humans have souls. That's why they're not machines, whereas all other animals do not have souls. So they're just brute material things like automatons. I'm convinced you'll know from these first few lectures that I'm a big fan of Chris Marker, and I'm convinced that one of these other videos from his bestiary series, that it's in some ways mocking Descartes. It's called An owl is an owl is an owl. So you get the sense like each owl is just the same thing. It's just a machine that was made on an assembly line that's identical from the other. And he does this. I'll show it to you. I won't play the whole thing because it's too long for our purposes. But I'll just show you a brief the opening part. The voice track is this electronic voice that keeps saying over and over, an owl is an owl is an owl, as you're seeing these owls. And you get the sense that the owls are like these well-oiled machines, because their heads swivel in such a seamless way. So it goes on like this for a little while. I won't show you the whole thing. It's about, I think, 4 minutes long or something, but I don't want to lose too much time. And you get a good sense of it. So there's a way in which Marker's, it almost sounds, it seems like this is he's kind of taking a dig at Descartes. At least that's what I argue. Showing you all these owls as these robotic entities. They almost become alien. I don't know how you receive it, but there are moments where it almost becomes a bit creepy, very uncanny. These big eyes, and these seamlessly moving heads swiveling around and then looking at you, looking at the camera. But of course, Marker, we already know Chris Marker does not think animals are simply machines. He thinks that they're feeling and beings. They're entities that are alive. So if we move forward from Descartes, once we get to the middle part of the 18th century in 1753, we have something very important that happens, which is Linnaeus' book that he publishes, his Natural System. And this is the first scientific organization of all life, plants, animals, and humans. And he has a really tough time with the human because he doesn't quite know where to put the human. Is the human part of the animal kingdom, or is the human separate from the animal kingdom? Already, even before Darwin here in 1753, there's this uneasy feeling about where humans go in nature. And he even nominates, this is well known, he nominates the orangutan, which is a primate, as a type of man. Because I don't think he'd ever actually seen one, but there are stories of orangutans like being men living in the forest, right? So you can already tell right from the beginning of trying to classify animal life that there's this uneasy tension between where humans, Linnaeus would have said man, where they fit within the scope of the natural world and of plants, animals, and humans. But it's very important because this is the first, more or less, taxonomy of the natural world. There are two limitations, however. One is that this was still, from a strict scientific point, this was still a theological creationist view of the world. It didn't have Linnaeus didn't have an understanding of evolution. He just assumed that all these animals were created by God, and then now he's ordering them, right? The other limitation is that the hierarchy is anthropocentric, that the human is on top. So there's a clear bias in the favor of human life as being at the top, there's a long lineage of this. Within religious thinking in Christianity. You have God, heaven, you have angels, then you have humans, and then you have animals. There's like this creationist ladder. And so he's still part of this creationist ladder of life. And the second big limitation is that he articulates the concept of a species. And his binomial system, the names that he gives, those are still used by biologists and by ethologists today. Like Homo sapien comes from Linnaeus. It's still used today, but the concept of species is tricky because it always has a flattening effect. Animals are just treated as types, so geese, cows, pigs, chimpanzees, elephants. It's as if they're just this type, and that within the species there's no real variation. This is something more recently. Cognitive ethologists and people studying animal behavior or behavioral ecology out in the wild, they notice that, well, there's something wrong here because there's a lot of variation within species. So species as a category has this tendency to sort of flatten life, when in fact life even within one species has all this variety and variation, even within like one commune, even within one troop or one pack, right? So it's interesting to think about the limitations of these things. Then you have what is still one of the most consequential moments in human history and in human thinking is Darwin, who comes along in the 19th century, and he expounds his theory of evolution. And there are so many consequences for this. This resulted in so many consequences. One, it made behavior and species and life itself unmoored from being fixed. Like it became historical. Like we started to understand life as a process. It didn't just all get created at one point and then it's just timeless. But life is something that's conditioned and that evolves and that's historical. And so it de-theologized life. Animal life, plant life, was explained by purely natural processes of time and evolution and conditioning and adaptation and all these things within evolutionary theory that had nothing to do with a transcendent deity that was somehow pulling the strings, right? Darwin was also someone who, unlike Descartes, said it's very obvious that animal behaviors have a great complexity, that animals feel things, that animals think, that animals have emotions. And so this is very important because then you can have people come along to study these things. No longer are animals thought to be mindless, thoughtless, feelingless machines, but animals are deemed to be animals of emotive and thinking behavior, like us humans. And this is where we get to maybe the most consequential idea in Darwin's history of evolution, is that humans are not outside of all this. Humans are one animal among others within this planetary existence that we find ourselves in. And so he stresses the connectedness, the evolutionary network of both human and non-human animals as part of a continuum. So there's no break. There's no humans have souls and then animals don't have souls, or humans are different from animals in certain ways. Humans are primates within an order of primates, within a larger order of mammals, within what we understand animals to be, right? So this is really, really consequential for the history of thought. And then we fast forward, because someone like Darwin, even more than Conrad and Tinbergen and von Frisch, these ethologists, who really didn't want to talk about thinking, consciousness, feeling, because these are hard things to pinpoint scientifically. You can't really point to an emotion or a thought and say, there it is. Now we classify it. Now we scientifically observe it, right? These are things that even in humans are hard to see and discern in a very empirical way. But in the 1960s, you have someone like Jane Goodall, who's wonderful, by the way. She's still alive. She's such an eloquent speaker, and she's a conservationist. She's an animal rights person in many ways, and she talks very eloquently about the climate, about global warming and the climate crisis that we face. So if you ever want to hear her speak, just Google some of her more recent talks or her speeches, and she's really wonderful. But as a young student, as a primatologist beginning in the 1960s, she was one of the first to study chimpanzees out in the wild, but then treat them as individuals, and even gave them names. And even credited them with, complex forms of thinking and emotional behavior and attachment, right? And so you can imagine a woman, a very young woman, working within a scientific discipline in the 1960s. She was ostracized and criticized by her mostly male colleagues, who just accused her of being sentimental, of projecting these human qualities onto animal qualities, which is called anthropomorphizing, which is a complex idea that we'll end up talking at some point in this class for sure. And so she was really criticized for this. But today, and it's no longer controversial to think of chimpanzees as very high level animals with individual personalities. There's even a whole field of personality studies in ethology, in behavioral ecology and primatology. And so you'll probably see this, you'll note this in those wonderful experiments that Frans de Waal talks about in the video I've shared with this class. So Jane Goodall is very, very important. And then by the time you get to the 1990s, you have someone like Donald Griffin come along, also not without controversy, but he publishes a book called Animal Minds. And he's the first to start talking about cognitive ethology. So moving away from ethology as this thing that only talks about instincts, that reduces animals to instinctual behavior and fixed reflexes and that sort of thing. But he dares to start talking about animals as these cognitive beings, beings that think, that have consciousness, and that have preferences and that deliberate on their lives, and then they'll adapt. So in the same way that you think of yourself as flexible, as changing over time, as in some way having control over your destiny because of self-modification of behaviors, he starts to talk about non-human animals as having these same things. And more than this, they're also animals having the ability to reason, to be able to think in an if-when sort of way. Animals having the ability and showing the capacity to mourn a friend or a family member dying, the ability to empathize. And you in the Frans de Waal video, you see this ability to empathize or to be sympathetic to those around you. So by the 90s, with cognitive ethology, you start to have these scientists, these ethologists, who really go as far away from Descartes' theory of the animal machine as possible to treat non-human animals as having all these complex forms of living that people used to think that only humans had. Only humans have memory, can use logic, can mourn, can empathize, can think, can reason. But now all these other animals have been shown to be able to do all these things. And if you pay attention, if you look at news that comes out of almost every day we learn something new. Crows using tools, little baby chicks who can do math. One of the more big recent developments is a long time it was thought like fish couldn't feel pain, but it's very likely, it's probably overwhelmingly the case that fish can feel pain, right? Cooperation, all these things. Like we're finding out just incredible things about all sorts of different animals and their capacities for intelligence and emotion and living on this planet, right? So this is actually why I start this course with ethology, because it starts to get us to understand really what animals are in a more full way than you might normally think of them, right? So ethology is very, very important here. And so now we'll end this lecture, I've finished now the introduction to ethology and cognitive ethology and the history of studying animal behavior. Now I just want to show you some examples. So this is less sort of theoretical and dense. This will be just more about some examples where we deploy some of these ideas and these new breakthroughs that we've learned about animals. So once more, I think this is the last time I show you Chris Marker, but this is another little short video work from his bestiary series. It's called Chat écoutant la musique, which means cat listening to music. And he's listening to, I think it's Eric Satie, but I can't remember now who the composer is. But this is 1985, 1990, way before YouTube videos, way before cats becoming a staple of online culture. And there's a cat named Maru, a cat that lives in Japan, who has, I think the owner uploaded a video at some point, and then it just went viral, nuts, like crazy viral. And now this cat has his own YouTube channel and millions and millions of subscribers. And the argument can be made that this cat is the most watched animal in history, in some ways, right? But this is 1985, 1990. And this is this very beautiful, contemplative, short video of Chris Marker's his cat, just sleeping on his keyboard and interacting with the music and interacting with his or her surroundings. And what's lovely about this work is that the calm sort of contemplative feel that we get as human viewers, we have a hard time not thinking that this cat who's completely chill and totally laid back and just looks like he's in a food coma or something like that, he's also very chill and very relaxed and just sort of enveloped by this quiet music. And so there's a relay, there's a communication of emotion between us as humans and between Marker's cat as a non-human animal, as a feline. So again, I won't show you the whole thing for time, but then we have someone like John Isaacs, who does these really creepy sculptures. This is his untitled monkey, a monkey who looks like he is not well at all. And in fact, he's injecting himself with a needle. And so there's almost this sense that this monkey is an addict. This monkey is unwell. He's lost all his hair. I'm always creeped out by this sculpture because of the hair loss and the sadness that's evoked by this monkey. But also, if you notice the feet, they look more like hands. It looks like he has 4 hands, right? So all doesn't seem well with this monkey, which gets to the idea, like one of the reasons I show this work is that you might think that it's only humans that have post-traumatic stress disorder, that have addictions, that have psychic disturbances, and mental problems. But that's definitely not the case. There are now all sorts of documented studies of non-human animals afflicted with trauma, afflicted with self-destructive behavior, afflicted with disturbing with emotional disturbances, right? One of the most famous, or one of the most celebrated, I think, are the dogs that were used in 9/11 to try to find survivors in the rubble. And a couple years ago, the last first respondent dog died. I think I show this to you in a couple lectures from now. But it was well established that these dogs had PTSD from their time in the rubble, from the time of going through this horrible tragic event of 9/11 and trying to find all these bodies, and then probably finding only dead bodies in the rubble and never really finding anyone living. This had a real toll on the dog's emotions, on the dog's minds. And so that's one example of just so many of animals becoming mentally disturbed because of something that happens in their lives. Parrots are well known. It's well known that parrots will start to rip off all their feathers when they get stressed out, when they're confined too much, and so on and so forth. So there's something evocative about John Isaac's Untitled Monkey, this sense that this monkey looks like he's really suffering from a type of emotional disturbance. The other really fascinating thing is to talk about language, animal language. Another thing that we've, for the longest time, thought only humans had language. But that's not true. There's a very famous study of these prairie dogs. A scientist, an ethologist, studied this whole pack of prairie dogs, and he came to find, after, this is like 30 years of study, he came to find that they spoke to each other, that the sounds that they made actually referred to things out in the world, and that if he approached them, they would use like an all friendly type of sound, but if a stranger approached, the stranger would then evoke a different sound that told everybody that this is a stranger, be careful. All the way down to like color, colors of hats, and they seemed to have a whole sign system that they could communicate to each other as a collective, as a community, in order to understand their surroundings and to be cooperative with each other. So human speech is phonetic, and we use signs and symbols, and these are, from what we know, the most complex language. But it's only complex in a circular way, right? We say it's complex because it's ours. But whatever the case might be, there are all sorts of other forms of animal languages, of sounds and gestures and movements that point to things in the world that qualify as a type of language. And so you've had artists who interrogate this in various ways. This is Hans Hacke, a German artist who becomes well known in the early 70s. He has a work called Norbert, All Systems Go. Explaining the title would open a whole other can of worms, but just know that this is a magpie who are very intelligent birds. The corvid family, like crows, ravens, magpies, they're as intelligent as primates. They can use tools, they're incredible, and they can speak. They can use and be taught human languages, and so he tried to teach this magpie, or I think it was a maybird, a myra bird, a myna bird. It's also a corvid. Myna birds can speak, or can be taught to speak. So this is an example of that. Then there's a more recent work. This is very, very beautiful work by Alora and Calzadilla from 2014. This is called The Great Silence, and it has everything to do with parrot intelligence and the ability of parrots to speak. And we know that when parrots, we now know, the cliche is that parrots just parrot. They just mimic. They don't know what they're saying. They're just mimicking, right? But now scientists have understand that actually no, parrots, when they use words that they've been taught, they also have been shown to also have the concept of the word and they're able to use that concept through the human speech and interaction with humans. And so I'm going to show you this work. This is one of the last ones I'll show you. It's a video work. I only show you, I think it's the first few minutes. What you need to know before looking at it is that these artists, this is in Puerto Rico, and in Puerto Rico, there are two things there. Well, there's more than two things, but in this video, there are two things that you're shown. One, a sanctuary for Puerto Rican parrots. Puerto Rican parrots have become endangered because of deforestation, because of incursions into the natural habitats. So you have that, and that's spliced together with this large satellite dish, which is the SETI, which was built, I think, in the 1960s. It's one of the first and still the biggest satellite dishes to try to find extraterrestrial life, to try to find and communicate, to get signals from aliens, right? From beings, a form of intelligence that doesn't live on this world. And so the artist spliced these two things together because the SETI center is right by, in this protected forest where these Puerto Rican parrots have their sanctuary. And then they draw all sorts of really beautiful analogies between these two things. So that's really all you need to know going into it. So let me show you this work. There's no speaking. It's all subtitled with ambient sounds. So for the sake of time, I've only shown you the really the first half of this film. If you want to see the whole thing, it's on Vimeo for free. So check it out. And it's such a rich work. And I'm actually in the process of finishing a book, and one of the chapters, a book on artists, on the relationship between ethology and artists. And one of the books focuses really almost solely on this work. So if you choose to, as part of your response, as part of your essay for this first week, if part of what you read about involves this work, I'm intrigued. I'll be interested to hear what you have to say, because it's such a rich and interesting work, both visually and conceptually. And so Ted Chiang worked with Eloy and Calvadia. Ted Chiang, you may know him. He's a pretty well-known, one of the best science fiction writers that we have right now. And he actually wrote the screenplay for Arrival. Arrival was based off of one of his stories. And if you haven't seen Arrival, I think it's one of the best recent science fiction films. And I don't want to spoil much of anything if someone hasn't seen it yet. But it's a great film in the sense that it really takes seriously what it would mean to communicate with an alien life form. And what's interesting about the film is that the way in which these life forms are communicated with are not through speech, but they're through emotion, and they're through signs and symbols, almost like the squid that we started with, the cuttlefish that we started at the start of today's class. The ink becoming a sign and attesting to a consciousness or an intelligence or an ability to be I, right? So this is a nice moment to end on. I have a few other examples, but I think for time, this is good, and I've given you more than enough. So I hope you enjoyed our artist as ethologist, and until the next lecture, take care, everybody.